You step into the marble halls of imperial Rome, where the very stones beneath your feet have absorbed centuries of whispered secrets and unspoken fears. The air carries the scent of burning incense mixed with something more unsettling, the metallic tang of absolute power exercised without restraint. Here, in these corridors where senators once walked with measured steps, we begin to understand how the machinery of empire operated not just as a political system, but as a force that fundamentally altered human nature itself. The Roman Empire of the early centuries CE represented humanity's most ambitious experiment in concentrated authority. Within this system, a single individual wielded power over approximately 60 million souls, scattered across 3 continents. The psychological weight of such responsibility, or the absence of any meaningful check upon it, created conditions unlike any other in human history. Imperial succession had become a carefully orchestrated performance, each new ruler inheriting not just political authority, but an entire mythology of divine appointment. Citizens across the empire participated in elaborate rituals affirming their emperor's connection to the gods, their own survival dependent upon maintaining this sacred fiction. Yet behind the public ceremonies and architectural grandeur lay a more troubling reality: the complete separation of imperial decision-making from meaningful accountability. Archaeological evidence from sites like Pompeii and Herculaneum reveals how ordinary Romans navigated daily life within this system. Graffiti scratched into tavern walls speaks of concerns about grain distributions, taxation, and military conscription, the immediate ways imperial policies touched individual lives. These casual inscriptions, preserved by volcanic ash, remind us that behind every grand historical narrative existed real people struggling to understand forces far beyond their control. The imperial court itself operated according to its own logic, removed from the experiences of those it governed. Palace protocols developed over generations created an environment where flattery replaced honest counsel, where proximity to power mattered more than competence or wisdom. Those who entered this world found themselves participating in elaborate performances of deference, their survival dependent upon reading subtle signals and anticipating imperial moods. Contemporary accounts from historians like Tacitus and Suetonius, while sometimes embellished for dramatic effect, consistently document a pattern. Isolation breeds paranoia, and unchecked authority distorts human judgment. These weren't merely individual psychological failings, but predictable outcomes of systemic design. The imperial system, for all its administrative efficiency, created conditions that almost inevitably corrupted those at its center. Religious beliefs of the era compounded these dynamics. Mystery cults promising immortality or divine favor flourished throughout the empire, their influence extending even into imperial circles. The boundary between political authority and supernatural power became increasingly blurred, creating space for beliefs and practices that might seem extraordinary to modern sensibilities, but represented logical extensions of existing power structures. As we examine this historical moment, we must remember that the people living through it lacked our retrospective understanding. For them, the imperial system represented the natural order, the way civilized societies organized themselves. The psychological frameworks they used to interpret their experiences differed fundamentally from our own, shaped by different assumptions about authority, divinity, and human nature. The transition between emperors often revealed the system's underlying fragility. Succession crises exposed how much depended upon individual personalities rather than institutional stability. During these moments of uncertainty, the gap between imperial mythology and political reality became starkly apparent, forcing both elites and ordinary citizens to confront the arbitrary nature of their governance. Understanding this context becomes essential for comprehending the individual stories that emerged from this system. The emperors weren't monsters or madmen operating outside normal human psychology. They were people shaped by extraordinary circumstances, their decisions reflecting both personal psychology and systemic pressures that no human being was designed to navigate alone. You watch a young prince navigate the treacherous currents of imperial succession, each day bringing new lessons in the exercise of absolute power. The child who once played with wooden toys in palace gardens has become someone entirely different, transformed by circumstances that would challenge any human being's capacity for moral reasoning and emotional stability. The process of imperial formation began early, often in childhood, through exposure to rituals and responsibilities far beyond normal human experience. Young heirs learn to accept worship from adults, to make decisions affecting thousands of lives, to view themselves as fundamentally different from other human beings. This early conditioning created psychological patterns that would shape their entire approach to authority and human relationships. Palace education emphasized practical skills, military strategy, rhetoric, administrative management, while largely neglecting the development of empathy or moral reasoning. Tutors, dependent upon imperial favor for their positions, rarely provided the kind of honest feedback essential for healthy psychological development. Instead, they reinforced existing prejudices and encouraged the belief that imperial desires represented cosmic necessity rather than personal preference. The transition to full imperial authority often occurred during periods of political instability, when rapid decision-making seemed more important than careful deliberation. New emperors inherited not just political power, but also the accumulated fears and resentments of their predecessors. They entered their roles carrying the weight of family histories marked by assassination, betrayal, and constant vigilance against perceived threats. Contemporary psychological understanding helps us recognize patterns that ancient observers couldn't fully comprehend. The combination of unlimited authority, why constant flattery and social isolation creates conditions conducive to what modern psychology identifies as narcissistic adaptation, patterns of thinking and behavior that emerge as responses to abnormal social environments rather than inherent personality defects. Imperial paranoia followed predictable patterns. Surrounded by people whose survival depended upon pleasing them, emperors struggled to distinguish genuine loyalty from calculated performance. Every smile might mask resentment, every gesture of respect could conceal murderous intent. This uncertainty fostered increasing reliance on dramatic demonstrations of power, as if extreme actions could somehow produce authentic emotional responses from others. Religious beliefs provided both comfort and additional pressure. Imperial theology suggested that emperors enjoyed special relationships with divine forces, that their success reflected cosmic approval of their actions. This framework transformed personal desires into sacred mandates, making it psychologically difficult to question decisions or acknowledge mistakes. What might appear to observers as obvious errors became, within imperial logic, expressions of divine will. The influence of court advisors varied dramatically depending on individual imperial psychology and political circumstances. Some emperors surrounded themselves with experienced administrators who provided practical guidance within established protocols. Others preferred advisors who affirmed their most extreme impulses, creating feedback loops that amplified destructive tendencies rather than moderating them. Private imperial spaces, the personal apartments, gardens, and dining rooms where emperors spent their leisure time, became laboratories for exploring the outer limits of human desire and authority. Away from public scrutiny, surrounded only by slaves and trusted intimates, emperors could experiment with behaviors impossible in more conventional social contexts. These private worlds operated according to their own rules, shaped by individual psychology rather than social norms. The gradual erosion of moral constraints followed predictable stages. Initial transgressions, perhaps excessive punishment of perceived enemies or inappropriate relationships with subordinates, established precedents for more extreme behavior. Each boundary crossing made the next seem less significant, creating a psychological momentum toward increasingly problematic actions. Documentation from palace staff and imperial freedmen, preserved in fragmentary form through various sources, suggests that even those closest to emperors often struggled to understand their motivations. Servants who witnessed private behavior firsthand left accounts describing actions that seemed to follow internal logic invisible to outside observers. These testimonies remind us that imperial psychology operated within frameworks that made sense to those experiencing them, even when they appeared incomprehensible to others. Medical understanding of the era provided little insight into psychological health. Physicians focused on physical symptoms and humoral imbalances, lacking conceptual frameworks for understanding how social environments might affect mental state. This meant that concerning behavioral changes were often interpreted as evidence of divine influence or political necessity rather than responses to psychological pressure. The cumulative effect of these influences created individuals whose relationship to reality had been fundamentally altered by their circumstances. They weren't necessarily more cruel or ambitious than other people, but they had been shaped by experiences that no normal social environment could produce. Understanding their actions requires recognizing both their humanity and the extraordinary conditions that formed their worldview. You stand in the shadows of imperial policy as it transforms from abstract decree into lived reality for millions of people across the empire. The administrative machinery that seems so efficient from palace perspectives reveals itself as something far more complex and devastating when viewed from the ground level, where individual families struggle to survive the consequences of decisions made by people they will never meet. Imperial economic policies rippled outward from the capital with devastating precision. New taxation schemes, designed to fund military campaigns or architectural projects, arrived in provincial communities as armed collectors demanding immediate compliance. Families who had farmed the same land for generations suddenly found themselves unable to meet obligations they had no role in creating, their traditional ways of life disrupted by economic necessities originating thousands of miles away. The human geography of the empire reveals these patterns most clearly. Archaeological excavations of provincial towns show abandoned houses, hastily buried personal treasures, and evidence of population displacement that corresponds to periods of imperial expansion or internal conflict. Behind each empty dwelling lay a family's story, parents forced to choose between impossible alternatives, children separated from their communities, elderly people left behind when younger relatives fled to seek survival elsewhere. Regional administrators, caught between imperial expectations and local realities, often found themselves implementing policies they knew would cause significant hardship. Their correspondence, preserved in various archives, documents the psychological toll of serving as intermediaries between imperial authority and human need. Many developed elaborate justifications for their actions, creating mental frameworks that allowed them to continue functions, owning while participating in systems that caused obvious harm. Military recruitment policies particularly affected rural communities, where young men represented essential agricultural labor. Imperial demands for soldiers often coincided with critical seasons when their absence meant reduced harvests and increased vulnerability for entire communities. Mothers watched sons depart for military service knowing they might never return, while villages struggled to maintain basic functions with depleted populations. The experience of imperial slavery reveals the system's most fundamental contradiction between human dignity and political necessity. Enslaved people throughout the empire possessed the same capacity for suffering, love, and aspiration as any other human beings, yet imperial law treated them as property subject to their owners' unlimited authority. Archaeological evidence from slave quarters in imperial properties shows both the material conditions of their daily lives and the cultural practices through which they maintained their humanity, despite systematic dehumanization. Imperial religious policies affected different communities in distinctly personal ways. Local traditions that had provided meaning and community cohesion for generations could be outlawed overnight, forcing people to choose between spiritual integrity and physical survival. The psychological impact of such choices, documented in letters, inscriptions, and literary works from the period, reveals the profound internal conflicts created when political authority attempted to control spiritual life. Women throughout the empire faced particular vulnerabilities within imperial systems. Legal frameworks that granted extensive authority to male family members became even more problematic when combined with imperial policies affecting property rights, marriage law, and inheritance practices. Court cases, preserved in legal archives, document women's efforts to navigate systems designed without consideration for their perspectives or needs. Children represented perhaps the most tragic victims of imperial excess. Growing up in communities disrupted by warfare, economic exploitation, or political instability, they experienced psychological trauma that affected entire generations. Educational opportunities, cultural transmission, and family stability, all prerequisites for healthy child development, became casualties of imperial policies prioritizing short-term political objectives over human flourishing. The imperial communication system, while administratively impressive, created profound disconnection between decision-makers and those affected by their choices. Emperors received information filtered through multiple layers of bureaucracy, each level incentivized to minimize problems and emphasize positive outcomes. This systematic distortion meant that policymakers operated with fundamentally inadequate understanding of their actions' human consequences. Provincial communities developed various strategies for survival within imperial systems. Some emphasized compliance and integration, hoping to benefit from imperial prosperity. Others maintained covert resistance networks, preserving cultural practices and mutual aid systems that operated parallel to official structures. Most combined elements of both approaches, adapting to immediate necessities while maintaining whatever autonomy remained possible. The psychological impact of living under imperial authority affected entire populations in ways that contemporary sources only partially document. Constant awareness that individual lives could be disrupted by distant decisions created chronic anxiety and hypervigilance. Community bonds, traditionally sources of security and meaning, became complicated by questions about collaboration, resistance, and survival that had no clear moral answers. Imperial propaganda systems worked to maintain public support by emphasizing benefits of imperial rule while minimizing acknowledgement of its costs. Public monuments, festivals, and official literature created narrative frameworks that justified suffering as necessary sacrifice for greater good. Yet private correspondence and personal documents from the period reveal that many people maintained more complex and critical perspectives on their experiences than public expressions suggested. Understanding these human costs requires recognizing both the scale of imperial impact and the resilience of those who lived through it. Communities found ways to preserve dignity, maintain relationships, and create meaning even within systems designed to subordinate their needs to imperial objectives. Their stories remind us that political systems, however powerful, never completely determine human experience or eliminate the capacity for moral choice. You witness the remarkable ways human beings preserved their dignity and humanity, even within systems designed to crush individual agency. Throughout the empire, people developed strategies for survival that went far beyond mere compliance, creating networks of mutual support and maintaining cultural practices that sustained hope even in the darkest circumstances. Underground networks of mutual aid operated throughout imperial territories, often building upon existing kinship ties, religious affiliations, or professional associations. These informal systems provided assistance during crises, shared information about opportunities and dangers, and maintained social bonds that official imperial structures couldn't replace. Archaeological evidence of communal storage facilities, shared workshop spaces, and collective burial sites reveals the material infrastructure of these support networks. Religious communities proved particularly effective at maintaining alternative value systems within imperial contexts. Early Christian communities, Jewish diaspora populations, and various mystery cults created spaces where different concepts of authority, dignity, and human worth could be preserved and transmitted. Their internal practices, communal meals, mutual financial support, spiritual guidance, provided practical alternatives to imperial social structures. Cultural preservation took many forms throughout the empire. Local languages survived despite official pressure to adopt Latin or Greek. Traditional stories, songs, and customs continued through oral transmission even when written documentation became impossible. Craftspeople maintained regional artistic traditions, embedding cultural symbols and meanings into everyday objects that carried messages invisible to imperial authorities. Economic resistance manifested through various strategies that challenged imperial control wit. Haute direct confrontation, barter networks that bypassed official currency systems, informal labor arrangements that avoided taxation, and communal ownership patterns that protected resources from imperial confiscation all represented ways communities maintained some economic autonomy despite official policies. Individual acts of moral courage often occurred within contexts that made them invisible to historical documentation, but essential for maintaining human dignity. Servants who treated enslaved people with kindness, despite legal permissions for cruelty, administrators who found ways to minimize harm while implementing harmful policies, ordinary citizens who provided assistance to persecuted minorities. These daily choices created spaces of humanity within inhumane systems. Women throughout the empire developed particular strategies for navigating legal and social constraints. Some used religious organizations to create female leadership roles unavailable in secular contexts. Others leveraged family networks to maintain influence over property and resources despite legal limitations. Many found ways to educate daughters and transmit knowledge across generations, even when formal education remained restricted. Educational practices adapted to imperial restrictions through informal networks that preserved knowledge and critical thinking skills. Private tutoring, apprenticeship systems, and family-based learning helped maintain intellectual traditions that might otherwise have been lost. These alternative educational approaches often emphasized practical wisdom and moral reasoning rather than the more limited curriculum of official imperial schools. Art and literature provided vehicles for expressing perspectives that couldn't be stated directly in political contexts. Symbolic imagery, allegorical stories, and coded references allowed artists and writers to communicate complex ideas about authority, justice, and human dignity while avoiding direct confrontation with imperial censorship. Modern analysis of surviving works reveals sophisticated systems of meaning that operated beneath surface compliance. Geographic mobility offered another form of resistance for those with sufficient resources and flexibility. Families and communities sometimes relocated to avoid particularly oppressive local conditions, seeking regions where imperial control was less intensive or where local administrators proved more tolerant. These population movements created informal networks of information and mutual assistance across vast distances. Professional guilds and trade associations provided organizational structures that could advocate for member interests within imperial systems. While officially focused on economic coordination, these groups often developed into mutual aid societies that provided assistance during emergencies, mediated disputes, and maintained standards of professional conduct that protected individual dignity within commercial relationships. Legal resistance, while dangerous, occasionally succeeded in challenging specific imperial policies through careful use of existing legal frameworks. Some individuals and communities developed expertise in imperial law that allowed them to protect their interests through official channels. These legal victories, even when limited in scope, demonstrated that imperial authority wasn't completely arbitrary and provided models for others facing similar challenges. The preservation of historical memory represented perhaps the most important form of resistance. Families, communities, and cultural groups found ways to maintain accurate records of their experiences, ensuring that future generations would understand both the costs of imperial rule and the strategies that enabled survival. This historical consciousness provided foundation for later resistance movements and cultural revival efforts. Documentation of resistance activities was necessarily limited by security concerns, but surviving evidence suggests widespread networks of people committed to preserving human dignity within imperial systems. Letters written in coded language, artifacts buried for safekeeping, and oral traditions maintained across generations all testify to the persistent human refusal to accept dehumanization as natural or permanent. Modern archaeological techniques have revealed evidence of resistance activities that were invisible to contemporary imperial authorities. Hidden religious symbols, concealed storage spaces, and architectural features designed to facilitate covert meetings all demonstrate the sophisticated planning that supported alternative social organizations throughout the empire. These resistance strategies succeeded not by overthrowing imperial authority, but by maintaining alternative visions of human possibility that could sustain people through difficult periods and provide foundation for different futures. They demonstrated that political systems, however powerful, could never completely control human imagination or eliminate the capacity for moral choice and mutual aid. You examine the long shadows cast by imperial history, recognizing patterns that extend far beyond the specific circumstances of ancient Rome. The psychological dynamics we've explored, the corruption of absolute power, the human cost of unchecked authority, the resilience of communities under pressure, continue to manifest in various forms throughout human history, offering essential insights for contemporary civic engagement. Modern psychological research has confirmed many of the patterns observable in imperial history. Studies of authority and obedience, conducted in controlled environments, demonstrate how normal people can be induced to participate in harmful actions when placed within certain institutional contexts. The Stanford Prison Experiment, Milgram's obedience studies, and similar research projects reveal that the capacity for both cruelty and moral courage exists within ordinary human psychology, activated by environmental factors rather than inherent personality traits. Contemporary political systems, while different in structure from ancient empires, sometimes exhibit similar dynamics. The concentration of decision-making power in distant institutions, the use of bureaucratic processes to implement policies without meaningful input from affected communities, the creation of systems where individual moral responsibility becomes diffused across institutional hierarchies. These patterns appear in various forms throughout modern governance structures. International relations research has identified the imperial overstretch phenomenon, where expanding authority creates internal contradictions that ultimately undermine systemic stability. Historical analysis of various empires reveals consistent patterns: initial expansion driven by military and economic success, followed by administrative challenges that require increasing coercion to maintain control, eventually leading to internal fragmentation and collapse. Understanding these cycles helps contemporary societies recognize warning signs and develop more sustainable approaches to governance. Educational implications of imperial history extend beyond simple cautionary tales. The stories we've examined demonstrate the importance of maintaining institutional checks on authority, preserving spaces for dissent and alternative perspectives, and ensuring that decision-making processes include meaningful input from those affected by policies. These lessons apply to organizations at every scale, from families and schools to corporations and governments. The resilience strategies documented throughout imperial history provide models for contemporary community organizing and mutual aid. The informal networks that sustained people through imperial oppression share characteristics with modern grassroots movements that address systemic inequality, environmental challenges, and social justice concerns. Historical analysis reveals both the potential and the limitations of bottom-up resistance efforts. Human rights frameworks developed over the past century reflect hard-won understanding of the patterns we've observed in imperial contexts. International law's emphasis on individual dignity, limitations on government authority, and protection for minority communities represents humanity's attempt to institutionalize the moral insights gained through painful historical experience. Yet the persistence of similar problems in contemporary contexts demonstrates that legal frameworks alone cannot prevent the recurrence of familiar dynamics. Media literacy and critical thinking skills become essential tools for navigating contemporary information environments that often exhibit characteristics similar to imperial propaganda systems. The same psychological mechanisms that made ancient communities vulnerable to manipulation, fear, tribalism, the appeal of simple explanations for complex problems, remain active in modern contexts. Understanding historical patterns helps develop resistance to contemporary forms of manipulation and coercion. The preservation of historical memory, which proved so important for resistance communities throughout imperial history, remains essential for contemporary civic engagement. Societies that lose connection to their own historical experiences become vulnerable to repeating mistakes that previous generations learned to avoid. This is why historical education and cultural preservation represent not merely academic exercises, but fundamental requirements for democratic citizenship. Climate change, global inequality, and technological disruption present contemporary challenges that require the same kinds of moral courage and collective action that sustained resistance communities throughout imperial history. Understanding how people maintained hope and effectiveness while confronting seemingly insurmountable systemic problems provides practical wisdom for addressing current global challenges. The individual moral choices that shaped daily life throughout imperial history continue to define human experience today. Each person's decisions about how to treat others, how to use whatever authority they possess, how to respond to injustice, and how to maintain integrity within imperfect systems contribute to the larger patterns that determine whether societies move toward greater freedom and dignity or succumb to the familiar cycles of domination and resistance. Historical consciousness empowers contemporary citizens to recognize their agency within larger systems. Understanding the full scope of human possibility, both for cruelty and for compassion, helps people make informed choices about the kinds of communities and institutions they want to create and support. The stories we've explored remind us that individual actions matter, that systems can be changed, and that human dignity represents a value worth preserving even under the most challenging circumstances. This examination of imperial history serves not to provide simple answers, but to develop the kind of historical awareness that enables thoughtful engagement with contemporary challenges. By understanding how previous generations navigated similar problems, we equip ourselves to make more informed choices about the future we want to create together.